long before skyscrapers, presidents, and power, there was a land of untamed forests, ancient tribes, and whispered dreams of freedom. This is the story of how 13 struggling colonies defied the greatest empire on Earth and gave birth to a nation that would change the world forever. Thousands of years before the idea of the United States was even imagined, the land was alive with the footsteps, voices, and traditions of the Native Americans, the first people of this continent. They were not one single nation, but countless tribes spread across forests, mountains, deserts, and rivers. Historians believe their ancestors came from Asia, walking across the frozen land bridge of the Bering Strait during the last ice age. Over thousands of years, they journeyed southward and eastward, filling every corner of North and South America with their presence. Life in this world was diverse and deeply tied to the environment. In the icy lands of the far north, the Inuit built homes from snow and ice, hunting seals and whales to survive the harsh winters. In the endless grasslands of the Great Plains, tribes like the Lakota and Cheyenne followed the roaming herds of buffalo, animals that provided them with food, clothing, and shelter. Their homes, the teepees, were designed to be carried from place to place, always moving with the rhythm of the buffalo herds. In the deserts of the Southwest, the Pueblo peoples created villages of clay and stone, their houses rising like towers from the earth, strong against the blazing sun. They learned to channel scarce water into their fields, growing corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters of their farming traditions. Along the great rivers, like the Mississippi, powerful civilizations thrived. The mound builders raised enormous earthen structures for ceremonies, burials, and gatherings, some taller than the trees that surrounded them. Farther west, in the forests and along the coasts, tribes became masters of wood and water. The Haida, Tlingit, and other coastal peoples carved great canoes from cedar trees, powerful enough to ride the ocean waves. They also created towering totem poles, symbols of their families, spirits, and history. Everywhere, Native Americans lived with a deep respect for the land. To them, the world was alive with spirit. The earth was their mother, the sky their father, the rivers their lifeblood. Animals were not only hunted for food, but honored as sacred beings. The eagle was a messenger of the heavens, the buffalo a symbol of strength and survival, the wolf a teacher of loyalty and endurance. Their songs, dances, and stories were ways of remembering and teaching, passed from one generation to the next. A child would sit by the fire and hear tales of heroes, of creation, of the spirits that guided their people. For thousands of years, this was their America continent, not of empty wilderness, but of nations, cultures, and traditions. Each tribe had its own way of life, yet all shared one truth. They belonged to the land, and the land belonged to them. In these early centuries, before the sails of European ships appeared on the horizon, this world of Native Americans was strong, vibrant, and complete in itself. The world of the Native Americans began to change in the late 1400s when the horizon of the Atlantic Ocean was broken by the sails of European ships. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, set foot on islands of the Caribbean. For him and the Europeans who followed, this was a new world. But for the native people, it was their ancient home. The arrival of Europeans marked the beginning of an age that would forever reshape the land and its people. After Columbus, Spanish explorers spread quickly, establishing colonies in the south and west. They searched for gold and silver, and where they did not find riches, they took land, forcing native peoples into labor. In Mexico and Peru, entire civilizations like the Aztec and Inca fell to Spanish conquest, their temples looted, their cities destroyed. The French also sailed across the ocean, claiming lands along the St. Lawrence River and the Mississippi. They built trading posts, exchanging metal tools and weapons for furs, and often forged alliances with native tribes. But it was the English who would leave the deepest mark on the lands that became the United States. In 1607, a group of English settlers founded Jamestown in Virginia. It was a small, struggling outpost at first, surrounded by forests and swamps, where disease and hunger claimed many lives. Yet it survived, and slowly grew into a permanent settlement. The settlers planted tobacco, which became their lifeline, traded with nearby tribes, and built homes and forts. This small colony became the seed from which a new society would grow. Not long after, in 1620, another group of English settlers crossed the ocean, the Pilgrims. They landed farther north, at a place they called Plymouth, in present-day Massachusetts. Unlike the adventurers of Jamestown, these settlers sought religious freedom. They came with families, carried with them a vision of building a godly community, and endured a harsh first winter where many died of cold and starvation. It was only with the help of Native Americans, who taught them how to plant corn and survive in the new land, that they managed to live. Throughout the 1600s and 1700s, more and more Europeans arrived. Some came to escape religious persecution, others to seek wealth, and still others were brought as enslaved Africans, forced to work on farms and plantations. The Atlantic coast of North America began to fill with towns, farms, churches, and marketplaces. Wooden ships carried goods back and forth between the colonies and Europe. A new society was taking shape, one rooted in European traditions but also transformed by the land and the peoples who had lived there for centuries. Yet beneath this growth lay conflict. Native Americans saw their lands shrinking as more colonists arrived. Diseases brought by Europeans, smallpox, measles, influenza, spread through native villages, killing millions who had no defense against them. Entire tribes disappeared, their voices silenced by invisible enemies. At the same time, enslaved Africans endured a brutal life, shipped across the ocean in chains, forced to work under whips and cruelty. This was the world of early America, a meeting of peoples, cultures, and worlds. It was a place of opportunity for some, of suffering for others, and of irreversible change for all. The stage was being set for the birth of a new nation, though few at the time could imagine what struggles lay ahead. By the early 1700s, 13 English colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast from the cold, rocky shores of New England to the warm fields of Georgia. Each colony had its own identity, shaped by the land and the people who lived there. In New England, towns were built around churches and schools, and communities valued hard work, education, and religious devotion. In the middle colonies, such as New York and Pennsylvania, fertile soil and bustling ports created wealth through farming and trade. In the South, vast plantations grew tobacco, rice, and indigo, crops that brought fortune to landowners but depended on the suffering of enslaved Africans. These colonies were far from England, across a wide and dangerous ocean, and as they grew stronger, many began to feel more American than English. They built their own assemblies, elected their own leaders, and passed local laws. Still, they remained under the authority of the British Crown, and the king expected obedience and taxes. For a long time, colonists accepted this, but with each generation, their sense of independence quietly deepened. Life in the colonies was a mixture of hope and hardship. Families built wooden houses, raised livestock, and worked long days in fields or shops. Children learned to read from the Bible, or if they were lucky, attended small schools. On Sundays, towns gathered at church. During harvests, they celebrated with feasts and fairs. There was freedom to dream, but there were also deep divisions. While some enjoyed prosperity, enslaved Africans toiled without rights or hope, and Native Americans continued to lose land as settlers pushed farther inland. As the 1700s wore on, the relationship between the colonies and England grew tense. Britain demanded more taxes to pay for its wars in Europe and against rival empires. Laws were passed that restricted trade, forcing the colonies to send their goods only to England. Many colonists began to ask, why should we pay and obey a distant king who knew little about our lives? Rumblings of resistance stirred in taverns, in churches, and in newspapers. The idea of freedom was taking root, still small, still fragile, but growing with each unfair law and each demand from across the ocean. It was an uneasy balance. The colonies were loyal subjects of the king, Yet they were also learning to govern themselves, building communities that did not always look to England for answers. Slowly, silently, a spirit of independence was rising, one that would soon burst into open conflict. The growing tension between the 13 colonies and Britain finally reached its breaking point in the 1770s. For years, the British government had tried to tighten its control over the colonies, demanding more taxes to pay for the cost of wars. The colonists had no representatives in the British Parliament, and so they began to cry out with a new slogan: "No taxation without representation." One of the most famous sparks came in 1773 in the city of Boston. Angry colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships and threw hundreds of chests of tea into the harbor. This act of defiance became known as the Boston Tea Party, and it sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. The British responded harshly, closing Boston's port and sending more soldiers to enforce their rule. But instead of silencing the colonies, these actions only fueled their anger. Soon, protests turned into open resistance. Farmers, shopkeepers, and blacksmiths began to train as soldiers, calling themselves Minutemen, because they were ready to fight at a minute's notice. In 1775, the first shots of war were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. What had begun as protests against taxes had now exploded into a full-scale revolution. In the summer of 1776, the leaders of the colonies gathered in Philadelphia to take a bold step. Men like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams worked together to write a document that would change history: the Declaration of Independence. Adopted on July 4, it declared that the colonies were no longer under the rule of Britain, but were now free states. Its words carried a powerful message. All men are created equal, and they are endowed with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These ideas lit a fire of hope, not only in America but eventually around the world. The Revolutionary War was long and difficult. The British Army was one of the strongest in the world, with trained soldiers and powerful ships. The American colonists, by contrast, were poorly equipped, often short of food, weapons, and clothing. Yet they fought with determination. Farmers left their fields, blacksmiths left their forges, and young boys carried muskets to join the cause of liberty. George Washington, a tall and steady leader from Virginia, was chosen as commander of the Continental Army. Though his troops often suffered in the cold and hunger, most famously at Valley Forge, they held together through courage and belief in their cause. Battles raged across the land, from the forests of New England to the valleys of the South. France, seeing an opportunity to weaken its old enemy Britain, joined the American side in 1778, sending soldiers, ships, and supplies. This support turned the tide of war. Finally, in 1781, at the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia, the combined American and French forces surrounded the British Army. Trapped and exhausted, the British commander Lord Cornwallis surrendered. The colonies had won their independence. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain officially recognized the United States of America as a free and independent nation. For the colonists, it was the fulfillment of a dream, an idea of liberty and self-government that they had fought and bled to achieve. Yet even in victory, challenges remained. The war had freed the colonies from Britain, but now they had to face the question: how would they govern themselves? The struggle for independence was over. But the struggle to build a nation was only beginning. When the war ended in 1783, the United States of America was free. But freedom alone did not guarantee stability. 13 colonies had become 13 independent states, each with its own laws, traditions, and interests. They were united by victory, yet divided by mistrust. Some feared that too much central power would lead to tyranny, while others worried that too little power would leave the nation weak and divided. At first, the new country was governed under a system called the Articles of Confederation. It gave most authority to the individual states and very little to the national government. Congress could pass laws but had no power to enforce them. It could ask states for money but could not demand taxes. There was no president, no national court system, and no single army strong enough to defend the nation. What had seemed like a safe way to avoid kings and tyranny soon revealed its weaknesses. The young country was drowning in debt, struggling to manage trade, and vulnerable to enemies abroad. By 1786, the problems grew so serious that leaders knew something had to change. In the summer of 1787, delegates from across the states gathered in Philadelphia. They met in a hot, crowded room inside Independence Hall, the same place where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. Windows were shut tight for secrecy, and debates stretched late into the night. These men, George Washington, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and others, argued fiercely about how to design a government that was both strong and free. Out of these debates came the United States Constitution, a bold new plan for the nation. It created 3 branches of government: the executive, led by a president, the legislative, made up of Congress, and the judicial, with courts to interpret laws. Power would be balanced between them, so no one branch could grow too strong. The Constitution also promised that ultimate authority came not from kings or rulers, but from the people. The Constitution was signed in September 1787, but it still needed to be approved by the states. Across the country, newspapers and town halls buzzed with arguments. Supporters, called Federalists, argued that the Constitution would protect liberty while giving the nation strength. Opponents, the anti-Federalists, feared it gave too much power to the central government. To ease these fears, a promise was made: a Bill of Rights would be added, guaranteeing freedoms such as speech, religion, and the press. By 1789, the Constitution was ratified, and the new government was born. The people chose George Washington as the nation's first president. His calm leadership and reputation as the hero of independence gave hope to a country still finding its footing. Washington set important precedents. He formed a cabinet of advisors, balanced disputes between states, and after 2 terms in office, peacefully stepped down, proving that American presidents would not become kings. The United States now had a working government, but it was still a fragile experiment. Native Americans continued to resist the loss of their lands. Enslaved Africans remained in bondage, their freedom denied even in a nation founded on liberty. Disagreements between North and South, between farmers and merchants, between states and the federal government, simmered beneath the surface. And yet, the Constitution gave the new country a foundation strong enough to endure. It was a living promise that people could govern themselves, and that liberty and law could exist side by side. The Revolution had created independence, but the Constitution created a nation. The birth of the United States was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. In the 1790s and early 1800s, the young nation faced challenges that would test its strength and unity. It was like a child learning to walk. Every step forward came with stumbles, yet each stumble carried lessons for the future. The country was deeply in debt from the Revolutionary War. Farmers, merchants, and the government itself struggled to pay what they owed. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, pushed bold plans to stabilize the economy, creating a national bank, raising revenue, and strengthening credit. These ideas helped secure the nation's finances, but also sparked fierce debates. Thomas Jefferson and his supporters feared too much power in the hands of bankers and the federal government, while Hamilton believed a strong financial system was necessary for survival. Out of these disputes, America's first political parties were born: the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Beyond politics, the nation's borders were restless. Native American tribes resisted the steady push of settlers into their lands, leading to violent conflicts in the Ohio Valley and across the frontier. At the same time, enslaved Africans continued to endure cruelty in the South, their labor building farms and wealth, even as northern states slowly began moving toward abolition. The contradiction was clear. The new nation had declared that all men are created equal, but millions of people remained enslaved. This wound would grow deeper over the decades, shaping the nation's destiny. The outside world also tested America. Britain and France, locked in their own wars, dragged the United States into their rivalries. British ships seized American sailors on the high seas, while France pressured America to support its revolution. Washington, and later President John Adams, struggled to keep the nation neutral, believing it was too young and fragile to be caught in Europe's conflicts. Their warnings would echo in American politics for years to come. Despite these challenges, there were moments of triumph. In 1803, under President Thomas Jefferson, the United States purchased the vast Louisiana territory from France, doubling the nation's size. The Lewis and Clark expedition set out to explore this new land, mapping rivers, meeting native tribes, and opening a vision of America stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. A country that had once been 13 small colonies was now imagining itself as a continental power. Through hardship and hope, the United States was carving out its identity. It was not a perfect nation, far from it. Divisions over slavery, the treatment of Native Americans, and conflicts between rich and poor were already visible. Yet its people carried with them a belief that the experiment of liberty was worth the struggle. Each generation would inherit that promise, and each would face the question of how to live up to the ideals written in the Declaration and the Constitution. The early years of the Republic were marked by uncertainty, but also by possibility. A fragile union of states had survived war, built a government, and begun to dream of a future larger than any king or empire had ever imagined. America's story had only just begun. From the voices of native tribes to the cries of revolution, from fragile beginnings to the promise of liberty, the story of America's birth is one of struggle, sacrifice, and hope. It was never perfect, never easy, yet it lit a flame that still burns today, the belief that freedom is worth fighting for, and that even the smallest of colonies can rise to shape the destiny of the world.